On the day of the funeral, she believed the hardest part would be saying goodbye, standing quietly among familiar faces, listening to polite condolences and well-meaning words that barely reached her. Because for years she had already been preparing herself for life without him, his illness slowly teaching her how to endure absence even before it arrived. And yet nothing prepared her for what came later, when the house fell silent and she was left alone with memories, paperwork, and the quiet responsibility of closing a life they had built together. Because it was only then, sorting through documents she had never touched before, opening drawers he always kept locked, that she noticed small inconsistencies she couldn't immediately explain. Unfamiliar names, letters that didn't match the timeline she remembered, and a subtle sense that something about the man she mourned was incomplete. And at first she dismissed the feeling as grief playing tricks on her mind, but deep down she felt a quiet pull, a question forming slowly, one she wasn't yet brave enough to ask because she still believed that even if life had been complicated, at least the truth of who he was had always been clear. Or so she thought.
The following days moved slowly, marked by routine tasks that felt strangely heavy, each one forcing her to confront the reality that he was truly gone. And yet the house still carried his presence in ways that unsettled her, from the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the hallway to the careful order of objects he insisted on keeping exactly as they were. And as she continued sorting through his belongings, she found herself hesitating more often, pausing before opening boxes or envelopes, as if some part of her sensed that not everything inside belonged to the life she believed she had lived. Because among old receipts and faded photographs, there were moments that did not fit. Phone numbers written in unfamiliar handwriting, travel documents she did not remember, and a set of keys labeled only with a single initial that meant nothing to her. And each discovery added a quiet pressure to her chest, not sharp enough to be panic, but persistent enough to demand attention. And while friends encouraged her to rest, to grieve properly, she felt an increasing need to understand, because grief alone did not explain the unease growing inside her. And at night, lying awake in a bed that suddenly felt too large, she replayed fragments of their life together, conversations she once dismissed, moments where he had grown distant for reasons she never questioned. And for the first time, she wondered whether love had made her generous or simply unaware. And though she still spoke of him with respect, defending his memory when others hinted at secrets, a small voice inside her began to whisper that perhaps the story of their life together was not finished, and that the truth, whatever it was, had been waiting patiently for her to notice.
It was a week later, during an ordinary afternoon, that the first real crock appeared, not dramatic or obvious, but quiet enough to slip past her defenses. Because while trying to cancel an old subscription, she logged into an email account they once shared for household matters, an account she had not opened since before his death. And as she scrolled through outdated notifications and automated messages, she noticed a folder she did not recognize, tucked away and never opened. And at first she assumed it was spam or something insignificant. Yet something compelled her to click it. And inside, she found a series of emails that were neither recent nor explicit, but carefully written, restrained, emotionally precise. The kind of messages people send when they are afraid of being discovered. Messages discussing missed connections, regrets about timing, and the quiet pain of loving someone from a distance. And as she read them, her initial confusion slowly shifted into disbelief, because the dates stretched back years, overlapping with anniversaries she remembered clearly, vacations she thought were happy, moments she believed had brought them closer. And suddenly those memories felt altered, as if a shadow had been present all along, just outside her awareness. And she tried to rationalize it, telling herself there must be an explanation, that she was misreading tone or context. But the more she read, the more undeniable the emotional weight became, because whoever had written these messages knew him deeply, spoke to parts of him she thought belonged only to her. And when she reached the final email, unfinished and never sent, she realized her hands were shaking, not from anger, but from the realization that love can exist quietly, invisibly, even inside a life that appears complete. And as she closed the laptop, she understood that she was no longer searching for comfort, only clarity, because something essential had been hidden from her for a very long time, and now that she had seen the first piece, she knew she could not stop until she understood the full truth. It was a week later, during an ordinary afternoon, that the first real crack appeared. Not dramatic or obvious, but quiet enough to slip past her defenses, because while trying to cancel an old subscription, she logged into an email account they once shared for household matters, an account she had not opened since before his death. And as she scrolled through outdated notifications and automated messages, she noticed a folder she did not recognize, tucked away and never opened. And at first, she assumed it was spam or something insignificant, yet something compelled her to click it, and inside she found a series of emails that were neither recent nor explicit, but carefully written, restrained, emotionally precise, the kind of messages people send when they are afraid of being discovered, messages discussing missed connections, regrets about timing, and the quiet pain of loving someone from a distance. And as she read them, her initial confusion slowly shifted into disbelief because the dates stretched back years, overlapping with anniversaries she remembered clearly, vacations she thought were happy, moments she believed had brought them closer. And suddenly, those memories felt altered, as if a shadow had been present all along, just outside her awareness. And she tried to rationalize it, telling herself there must be an explanation, that she was misreading tone or context. But the more she read, the more undeniable the emotional weight became, because whoever had written these messages knew him deeply, spoke to parts of him she thought belonged only to her. And when she reached the final email, unfinished and never sent, she realized her hands were shaking, not from anger, but from the realization that love can exist quietly, invisibly, even inside a life that appears complete. And as she closed the laptop, she understood that she was no longer searching for comfort, only clarity, because something essential had been hidden from her for a very long time. And now that she had seen the first piece, she knew she could not stop until she understood the full truth. As the pieces continued to fall into place, she felt a growing tension between what she wanted to believe and what the evidence quietly suggested, because for years she had trusted consistency more than transparency, assuming that stability meant honesty. And now that assumption was slowly dissolving, leaving behind a mixture of sadness and reluctant respect for the complexity of the man she had loved. And she found herself torn between preserving his memory and honoring her own experience, questioning whether uncovering the full truth would bring healing or simply deepen the ache. Yet something inside her insisted that ignorance was no longer an option, and as she revisited old photographs and messages with fresh eyes, she noticed patterns she had once dismissed: recurring absences framed as obligations, emotional distance softened by routine affection, and a careful avoidance of vulnerability that now felt deliberate rather than accidental. And this realization unsettled her because it forced her to confront not only his choices, but her own willingness to accept partial intimacy as sufficient. And as she reflected, she understood that love, when unexamined, can quietly adapt to imbalance, and that endurance, while admirable, can also become a refuge from asking difficult questions. And standing alone in the living room that evening, she allowed herself to grieve not just the man she lost, but the version of their relationship she believed was complete, recognizing that grief is rarely singular, often layered with realizations that arrive too late to be addressed directly. And yet, even in that heaviness, she sensed a subtle shift, a strengthening resolve to understand her life fully rather than protect a narrative that no longer aligned with the truth. Because only by facing what was hidden could she decide how to carry his memory forward without continuing to sacrifice her own clarity. In the quiet that followed her discoveries, she began to understand that the most painful aspect of what she was uncovering was not deception itself, but the gradual realization that she had been living alongside a version of him that was carefully curated. And this understanding forced her to revisit her own memories with an honesty that felt both cruel and necessary, because each recollection now carried two versions, the one she had lived in real time and the one reshaped by what she now knew, and this duality exhausted her in ways grief alone never had. Yet it also sharpened her awareness, making her more attentive to the emotional patterns she once overlooked, the way she had learned to accept emotional distance as maturity, how she praised restraint without questioning what it concealed. And as she reflected, she recognized how often she had equated loyalty with silence, believing that not asking difficult questions was a form of respect. And this realization unsettled her deeply because it suggested that the relationship they shared was not built on mutual transparency, but on parallel understandings that never fully intersected. And as she sat with this thought, she felt a quiet anger surface, not explosive or vengeful, but steady and clarifying, directed less at him and more at the expectations she had placed on herself to remain accommodating at all costs. And this anger, rather than consuming her, became instructive, revealing boundaries she had never allowed herself to articulate. And by the end of the day, she understood that whatever truth remained undiscovered was no longer something she feared, because the act of seeing clearly had already changed her. And even if the full picture proved more painful than she imagined, she was no longer willing to protect a version of love that required her to remain partially unseen. As the days passed, she noticed a subtle shift within herself. Not a dramatic transformation, but a steady reorientation, as if her inner compass had quietly recalibrated, and she began to move through her routine with a new attentiveness, observing how often she had once adjusted her emotions to accommodate uncertainty, how frequently she had accepted reassurance in place of understanding. And this awareness brought both sadness and a strange relief, because for the first time she was no longer questioning her instincts, and instead of asking why she had not seen the signs earlier, she focused on what it meant to see them now, at this stage of her life, when there was no one left to confront directly and no explanations left to demand. And this absence of dialogue forced her inward, compelling her to define truth not by confession but by recognition. And as she sorted through the remaining fragments of his life, small personal items, handwritten notes, objects he had kept without explanation, she realized how much of intimacy is built not on what is shared but on what is withheld. And this realization deepened her understanding of betrayal as something far more complex than infidelity, something rooted in emotional distance maintained over time. And while grief still surfaced unexpectedly, it now carried a different tone, less raw, more contemplative, allowing her to mourn not just the man she lost, but the certainty she once believed anchored her life. And in that mourning, she felt herself becoming more grounded, less dependent on answers that could no longer be given, and more willing to accept that some truths arrive not to be resolved, but to be integrated, shaping how one moves forward rather than defining where one must remain. In the end, she came to understand that the truth she uncovered was never meant to give her answers she could act upon, but perspective she could live with. And as that realization settled, it softened something inside her that had been tight for weeks, because she no longer felt compelled to reconstruct the past or defend the image of a life that once brought her comfort. And instead, she allowed the complexity to exist without resolution, recognizing that love and deception can coexist without canceling each other out, and that acknowledging this did not diminish what she had given, it clarified it. And as she began to imagine the years ahead, she felt neither fear nor urgency, only a quiet confidence rooted in self-awareness, knowing that while she could not rewrite the story she had lived, she could choose how it shaped her moving forward. And this choice, made without anger or denial, felt like a form of freedom she had never known, because it was no longer dependent on someone else's honesty or explanation. And as she carried his memory with her, she did so without illusion, holding both tenderness and truth in equal measure, understanding that healing does not always arrive as closure, but as acceptance. And that acceptance, earned through reflection rather than time alone, allowed her to step into the next chapter of her life with clarity, dignity, and a sense of wholeness that did not require forgetting, only understanding.